If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Hello and welcome to If This Goes On, Don't Panic. In this episode, we have author Ray Nayler. Kat, how are things going?
Things are going pretty well. It is summer-ish here. I've finally gotten to go out in my garden, and in the last 2 days, my buddy and I have cut down a dead tree and moved a tool shed, so I feel pretty mighty.
Oh, that's cool. That's a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
Getting things done. I have not done anything in the yard, and in fact, we are kind of observing no mow May again, and I'm pretty sure my neighbors are pissed at me because my grass is probably about knee height at this point.
Yeah.
And my neighbors across the street are like retired, and the guy is obsessive about his lawn, like to the point where the neighborhood kids are not allowed on it.
Oh, yeah.
So, mine's like knee high. He mows his like every single day pretty much because he's got nothing else to do. And it's just like...
Does he stand across the street and glare at yours?
Yeah, he does occasionally. I have caught him doing such things. And I just don't care. So he's going to have to suck it up.
Yeah, fair enough.
A couple things I wanted to mention real quick. First of all, for everyone listening out there, if my voice sounds weird or if there's some strange pauses once this has been edited, it's because I'm feeling kind of sick today. I have a little bit of a cough and stuff, so please forgive me. Hopefully we can get most of that out in production, but we'll see how it goes. There's one other thing I really wanted to say. A friend of mine who listens to the podcast occasionally, I saw him the other day, and he was like, Alan, you were really cracking me up the other day because you like went out and you announced your ADHD diagnosis like right on the pod, and you were so happy about it. And and I just thought that was a funny thing, you know what I mean? I'm glad that I made him laugh about it.
Yeah.
First of all. And he wanted to know like why I was okay doing that. And there's a couple reasons. One being representation. And because I think one of our major goals on the podcast is representation of all sorts, right?
For sure.
And knowing officially that I'm ADHD, I think is part of that. It's good to let people know that ADHD people are just another type of person and there's nothing weird or cartoonish about us. I mean, if you go on TikTok sometimes, you could think, oh, ADHD person is this weird cartoon character, right? Not the case.
Not the case.
But also, like, it was actually legitimately a huge relief to know what is going on in my brain.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
It's been 40 plus years of me, like, thinking, like, why can't I not remember where I put things? Like, no matter how hard I try, I just cannot remember where I put them. Because that's like one of the major issues that I have. And just random things like that, and it's just such a relief to be like, oh, like I'm not just losing my mind here. There's actually a reason for it, right. So to answer his questions and answer them publicly, because, other people might have felt the same way. That's why I did that. And I'm fine being ADHD. I don't think there's anything wrong with it, It's just who I am. So I don't think it's a big deal.
Yep.
Okay. So I know I went off on like a really long intro tangent. We don't usually do that.
Well, it's kind of funny that you did that while talking about ADHD.
Yeah, right. Well, you get me and Diane on the calls together, and we're just like,
oh yeah,
because she's like I am, and she's happy to say it too, and we're just like jumping around. You know what I mean? We're all over the place.
Yeah, but it's fun. I mean, and that's I think part of the charm of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so too. So anyway, I will get off my soapbox about that. Phil, I'm glad I cracked you up and made your day with that. I hope that answers your questions more articulately than I did the other day when we talked. So, anything else you want to say, Kat, or do you just want to dive into talking to Ray?
I will say ahead of time that I read this book I think I got an advanced reading copy and I just loved it. And I'm so excited to have Ray here to talk about it.
Nice. Yes, yes. And I want to talk about that more when Ray comes on, but I loved this book. Loved it. Something about it just struck a nerve.
Mm-hmm.
When we come back, we will have Ray Nayler with us. Okay, and we are back with Ray Nayler. Ray has been called one of the up-and-coming masters of SF short fiction by Locus. Ray Naylor's critically acclaimed stories have seen print in Asimov's Clark's World, Analog, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, Lightspeed, Vice, and Nightmare, as well as in many best-of anthologies, including the very best of the best, 35 years of the year's best science fiction. His stories, Yesterday's Wolf, won the 2022 Clark's World Readers Poll. In the same year, his story, and I probably am going to mispronounce this, Mualim, won the Asimov's Readers Award. His story, Father, in French translation, won the Bifrost Readers Award, and his novelette, Sarcophagus, was the finalist for the Theodore Sturgeon Award. For nearly half his life, he has lived and worked outside the United States in the Foreign Service and Peace Corps, including a stint as Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Officer at the U.S. Consulate in Ho Chi Minh City. He is currently International Advisor to the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So, Ray, thanks so much for coming on.
Alan, Kat, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I have to say, I've done several of these podcasts, but I've been waiting to do this one.
Hey, thank you.
That's very nice.
Kind of want to reference what I was saying in the introduction a little bit. Every now and then, there's a book that comes out and there's just like this instantaneous word of mouth. And the size of the publisher doesn't usually matter when this particular book comes out, right? And I just can't get away from it. And I know the book is going to be nominated for awards during the year. And this time it was your book. Why do you think it struck a chord with the science fiction community?
I have no idea. I did not expect it to be nominated for any awards. It was a complete surprise when it was nominated for the Nebula Award. My agent sent me a text and he said, "You may get a call from a number that you don't recognize. And if you do, pick up." And I was like, "Why?" And he's like, "Just pick up the phone." Because he knows that if I don't recognize a phone number, I generally won't pick up the phone. And I'm about picking the phone up anyway, even if I do recognize numbers. So I did. And it was the SIFWA president telling me that the book had been nominated for the Nebula Award. It was truly a surprise. And I mean, I'm not being modest or anything. I see this book as being pretty thorny in a lot of ways and unusual in its whole format and, kind of odd. And so I've been really surprised by the reception, the really positive reception that the book's got.
Yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah, I could imagine. You probably don't see things the way that I do, for example. I kind of keep my ear to the ground and I watch who's talking about what, you know what I mean, and how it goes from one person to the other a lot of times. It's just something that I do. And like actually being that person, I could imagine, just not picking up on it, at least if you're at all like me.
Well, I think that the book takes a really loved science fiction narrative, that of First Contact, and does something new and unexpected with it, and does it sort of doubly in that the communication with the octopi is not what the humans expect, and then the communication with Evrim, I think it is, is also, and it's so this idea about kind of different perceptions and language is something science fiction talks about a lot, but I have not seen it done this way before, and I've loved it also because I love octopuses.
Yeah,
because who doesn't?
Yeah, I love octopuses, and I have since I was a little kid. But I didn't think I was ever going to write a book about them. They just were something that I was fascinated by. But I've come to believe that maybe, and this is especially given because now, so this strange sort of time warp happens. Kat, I'm sure you understand this as an author as well, where like I'm talking about this book, but the obsessions of this book are no longer
Right.
what I'm working on.
Right.
I've written The Tusks of Extinction. I'm in the second draft and pretty much almost ready to give my agent, Seth, if you're listening, you may already have them in your hands by the time you get the podcast. About ready to give my agent my third book. And while I was just the day after the nebulas driving out to the Salton Sea, I got the idea for my next book.
Nice.
My mind is in like book number 4. I guess 3 if you count, if you don't count The Tusks of Extinction, which is a novella, but you know, I count it as a book. You know, I believe in the novella as like a short novel.
Yeah.
So I'm on book number 4 and this is kind of book number 1. So my mind has kind of gone to this different place. But I can say that while I was writing this book, I was very aware of the fact that it lined up with a whole bunch of lifelong sort of obsessions that I had. Maybe that's what every novel is the kind of like, you have this idea that you've had maybe since you were a little kid and you didn't even know you had it. And it kind of grows and grows and grows until you have to write a book about it.
So what was your first experience with an octopus?
Oh, I think my first experience was doing a 5th grade report on the octopus for a science class and going to the library and getting this book on octopuses by Jacques Cousteau.
Oh, yes.
You maybe even have seen the one with all these big full, color photographs in it.
Right.
And just getting really into, back then they didn't really understand the neurology and all these other interesting things about octopuses. Mm-hmm. So it was a little bit more surface, but just getting really interested in this very different creature.
So you talked about the timing of things, and I know that, gosh, the documentary about, what is it, My Teacher, the Octopus? I'm sure that had nothing to do with the book. Was that just a wonderful confluence of publicity?
Yeah, I think it's. I think this is what William Gibson calls steam engine time, right? Like where there's this thing that's kind of in the zeitgeist. A lot of different people are thinking about it, and all of a sudden, in the same year or 2 years, like 50 different people around the world invent the steam engine. And I think it's kind of happening with octopuses now, but I think there's some underpinning cultural reasons for that. I mean, I think that we're also moving into a very different way of looking at the world and at ecology. And I think that the octopus is kind of an interesting symbol for a lot of people because of that. Because we are kind of starting to think about other minds outside the human mind in ways that are more sophisticated, perhaps, than how we've thought about them before.
Well, have you seen this stuff recently about the orcas slamming into boats and actually teaching their calves how to slam into boats?
Oh yeah, that's pretty. Everybody's been sending me that link to that article. Everyone's like, Ray, it's your next book, and so it's been interesting to watch. Yeah, I mean, orcas are one of these very complex, big-brained animals where a lot of their behavior is learned behavior. And it doesn't surprise me. If you watch the way that orcas, for example, hunt seal on the ice floes, it's just as sophisticated as attacking a yacht would be, maybe more sophisticated. The whole pod cooperates, right, to create this certain kind of wave that knocks the seal off of the ice floe or breaks the ice floe up. And they can create different kinds of waves.
Oh, that's wild.
And this is a highly complex learned behavior, like the kind of thing that looks similar to synchronized swimming or something like that. So it's not too surprising that they would learn to do this. And I kind of made this joke on Twitter, but it's also not too surprising that they might be sick of our shit.
Right.
So I kind of understand it. It's my understanding that they're sinking sailing ships.
I think so.
Interestingly enough. And a lot of people theorize that the orca, the female orca who is teaching the other ones to do it and seems to be the main one involved in the attacks may have been collided with.
Oh my God. That's just even more fascinating. She's out there. She's like, rally behind me, my king.
Yeah. And I mean, remember that like there are whales in the 19th century and multiple incidents of them that hunted ships and destroyed them one after another. Moby Dick was just sort of really kind of ripped from the headlines.
God.
But that was another sort of learned behavior. So, there were whales that learned to destroy ships. And who knows, maybe if we'd had better observational capacities, we would have seen that those whales were teaching other whales to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Certainly whales are capable of teaching and learning.
Absolutely wild.
Before I ask another question, let me just propose that you and Sam Miller get together and write a book about orcas. Okay.
Sam Miller is so awesome. He's such a great guy. And Sam Miller is one of the people that was really nicest to me in the science fiction community.
Yeah.
Nice.
Kind of first starting to get a bit of a name as a short story writer.
Mm-hmm.
He's wonderful people. So yeah, I would love that.
Yeah, I love Sam. We've actually never interviewed him on this podcast, but I interviewed him
We should.
3 times on my old podcast or something. We definitely should. I don't know how we've not interviewed him at this point. Honestly, it's kind of mind-blowing.
I think you should immediately add him to the roster. Have you done that already?
I'm doing it right now.
All right.
But yeah, Sam's a great guy. He's the one who taught me how to take selfies of myself that don't suck.
That is a very useful modern skill.
It is.
For post.
It is. Up to that point, I was clueless. But I want to ask you more about animals. Like it's very clear from your book and from your job and everything you do, you really have a love for animals. Like where does that love for animals come from for you?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't exactly know where that came from. And I have to say that as a kid, I don't think I had any really distinct love for animals. Like I wasn't the kind of kid that was like super into animals at all. We didn't have pets when I was growing up because my parents were not the kind of people who would have allowed that. Mm-hmm. But like looking back, I also wasn't the kind of kid who was demanding a pet.
Mm-hmm.
I was really into insects. My first pet was a praying mantis, which is
cool.
a strange first pet to
Interesting.
have. And I didn't really have that many pets. I think that I think that I'm interested in general in living creatures, right? And interested in ecology and biology and this kind of thing. And interested in animals because they fascinate me because they have these forms of intelligence that are really difficult for humans to understand. And I just heard from Yogi Henlin, who is an academic working on biosemiotics, a great story, which is that in Sri Lanka, there were these villagers who lived on the coast. And in 2004, all of a sudden, their elephants that they had lived with for years, that they were using elephants in the forest to move logs and things like that. They were the kinds of people who are sort of integrated with elephants and are using the elephants both as labor, but really they become members of the family. So the elephants started to walk into the hills. And the people of these villages followed them. And short time later, the tsunami hit.
Oh.
The people in these villages that lived with elephants survived the tsunami, where many other villages, of course, did not. I mean, that was a horrific disaster that may have killed up to 500,000 people by some estimates. Right. They never really were able to count how many people's lives were lost. But I thought that was really fascinating. And what fascinated me about it was, if you can imagine, it's this incredible level of trust. These people were aware that the animals they lived with knew something that they didn't know. And they didn't know what that thing was, but they trusted those animals deeply enough to just do what those animals did. And I think that's sort of where, as a society, we almost need to get to, right? Like accept the fact that we don't have mastery over the world. There's a lot of things that we don't know. And we need to look at other intelligences and look at other ways of looking at the world and trust those ways of looking at the world and enter into a different kind of relationship with our biosphere, right? Our ecology, the planet, other animals around us. Because human beings have spent our entire existence tangled and entwined with other species. When you think about it, I mean, think about our relationship with the dog, right? With cats, with birds, right? The kind of urban relationships that we have with raccoons and rats and pigeons and other migratory species and and our domestic animals. Like we think about human beings, but what we don't think about very often, I feel like, is this tapestry that we have woven where we've entered into deep relationships with other species, some of them incredibly negative, and then other ones really rewarding and positive, like the relationships that we've entered into with dogs and cats, other pets that we have, where they've come to rely on us and we've come to rely on them as well for many things, mostly in modern times emotional, but at one point highly practical things. I mean, one of the interesting things about dogs, right, is that dogs bark and wolves don't. And the reason probably is that we probably at the time unconsciously selected for barking dogs because they warned us of danger. Right. But I think these are fascinating things that we need to look at more. Is that intelligence and all of these things don't end with the human. They extend outward. They always have. And that we've always been communicating with other species. And any pet owner fully understands that you're in a relationship with those animals, and there's reciprocal communication going on all the time. They ask for things and you give those things to them. You ask them to do things and they do them. Right? And moreover, there's these like very complex emotional interactions that are clearly understood, possibly in different ways, but understood by both parties. So that's kind of, if I have an affection for animals, I think that's sort of where it lies. It's in this fascination with the ways in which animals open up other vistas for understanding the world that we live in.
I think you really hit on something that I kind of wanted to talk about, and I have some notes about this. Seeing the world holistically, as one gigantic thing where everything is intertwined, because I really feel like our culture tries to separate out every single little thing and act like everything isn't connected. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
And I think it just causes a lot of problems, really.
Yeah, I mean, in Buddhism, there's a concept called dependent co-arising. Yeah. And that's exactly that concept, that everything touches upon everything else. And everything arises along with everything else. And that there's no such thing as being separate from the world around us. Yes. We're intertwined, we're tangled with that world, we're a part of it. And I think that, the difference in the world that we're living in right now, to kind of get sort of Foucault on you, right? The difference in the episteme in which we are existing right now and the episteme of the 1970s or so is that a lot of these things sounded really woo-woo in the 70s, right? And it was like, well, that's a very hippie way of looking at things. But the fact is that, blah, 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 right? It's all very, separable, and we're individuals and this kind of thing. And now, and I think maybe climate change and the awareness of the globe's limitations and the stresses that we've put on it have helped this come about. It doesn't sound strange at all to say that everything is connected, because we know that it's true as a fact and a real, a real depiction of how life is. Everything really is intertwined. And, I think there's been a power to Western science and this idea of separating things out and analyzing them. But now even science has turned much more towards systems theory and the analysis of the ways things operate within their ecologies and their environment. It's been a slow turn and painful, because I think that people resist that. And I think one of the reasons that they resist it is because it changes our ethical stance. And a different moral response to the world. And a lot of people just are not ready for that.
Yeah.
I just love everything that you just said. And I love that you brought Buddhism too. I was actually going to bring up that exact thing. Gosh, so much going through my head right now about all of it. Yeah, I mean, the first time I realized everything was connected, you guys are probably going to laugh about this. I was in college, long time ago. Just for anyone else who might be listening to this. And I've been turned on to Buddhism by reading the Beats, right? Because I was a lit major, and the Beats, like Kerouac and Ginsberg and all of them, they were big into Buddhism. So I had started studying Buddhism, and I had these ideas kind of floating in my head. And then I took LSD. And I was just like, oh my God, I completely, and like, people make fun of that. I've heard Buddhists, say, that's not really the real thing, that you should not, make those connections while you're inebriated and so forth. But honestly, I mean, that really changed my whole view of everything and has stuck with me since then. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do understand what you mean. My first introduction to Buddhism was actually via Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, which I think I came across in the library. Yeah. And then later through the Beats, like a lot of people, a lot of Americans were introduced to Buddhism that way. I think that's a pretty regular pathway. I think LSD is another, fundamentally normal pathway to that kind of thinking that everything is interconnected, and I think that the reason is that we're very reluctant when we're sober to have any kind of epiphanies, and we're good at explaining them away. And I think that some of those drugs, they just kind of take the inhibitions down more than being hallucinogens. They're probably just a way of taking your blinders off and making it more difficult for you to filter things out. But anyway, that's a very familiar story, and there's certainly nothing to be ashamed of there. That's a pretty regular way to come at it. But I do think that, so the way that I see Buddhism now is very different from how I saw it then. And I actually find it a little bit difficult, if I'm perfectly honest, to read the Beats now.
I haven't tried in a while. I'd be interested to go back and see, though.
Yeah. Certain Beats. I find it difficult to read Kerouac. I find it difficult to read Ginsberg, and I find it, for various different reasons. But what I think now is that there's an interesting thing that happens in the 5th century BC or so, which is that all of a sudden you get philosophy. And it happens in a lot of different places. And interestingly enough, it happens in Greece and it happens in northern India at about the same time. And Socrates and the Buddha are virtually contemporaries. In fact, they may have been contemporaries, depending on what the Buddha's timing was. And there's a lot of argument over that. And I think the reason that happens, one of the reasons is that the Buddha is existing at this time of urbanization, in which, in his society, human beings are becoming more and more abstracted from their environment and from nature. Their lives are becoming more separate from the sort of simple existences that they had before. They're becoming complexly structured, and people are gaining professions that they didn't have, and things are very abstract. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that Buddha's first sense of discontentment, and the thing that launches him out into the world and gets him to start going on these sort of adventures, right, that lead to him eventually becoming enlightened, happens in a garden, right? Because a garden is the quintessential, human-controlled space in which we seek to harness nature and bend it to our will. Right? To organize it and make it ours and possess it in this really fascinating way. And I think that he recognized the falseness of that attempt. And the intuition kind of arises from his sense that no matter how much we try to control everything, there are still these inevitabilities to life, right? Old age, sickness, and death are what he identifies. And these are the things that throw him into this great existential crisis. And his existential crisis is really similar to the existential crises of Heraclitus and other, Western philosophers as well. So there isn't really much in the 5th century BC of an East-West divide in these ways of thinking, but there's a big divide in the cultures in which they're embedded, right? So the Buddha is embedded in this culture that is very much about reincarnation and karma and all of these things. And these all pre-exist him. And so when he's explaining his philosophy, he's explaining it via the systems that he exists in. And he's limited by those systems in a way that Socrates is limited by his own systems that he is explaining things to. But the intuition is sound. And the primary intuition really is of the connectedness of all things, right? And it's an extraordinarily sound intuition because it's been scientifically tested, right? And it's verifiable. I mean, that's what's fascinating about Buddhism, is that if you reject the religious aspects of it and you focus on the early Pali canon, and the Buddha as a philosophical figure, you find that the things that he says in his philosophy are things that we're still coming to grips with as a scientific society through experiment and observation.
And Ray, you have explained more articulately than I ever could have why I'm a secular Buddhist.
You can just carry that around on your phone and play it to people if they.
I am like,
so you don't have to repeat it all.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. I'm definitely gonna be recording that. That's gonna be my ringtone or something.
That was a long ringtone.
I don't answer the phone ever, so it'll just. I love it. I love it. Can I ask what your relationship with Buddhism is?
Yeah, I mean, I really view it as a philosophy. I view religion in general. I mean, this is my personal opinion, is that religion is in general the incrustation that occurs over time to philosophy. That what happens is someone comes up with a new model for the world that is usually revelatory and more accurate than the model that came before it in some way. Mm-hmm. And then that revelation is seized upon by other people for profit, or turned in some way, or ritualized, or turned into a habit of thinking. Mm-hmm. So that the religious aspects of it, I feel, are often spiritually useless. But the initial revelation is useful as a metaphor or a model for the world. So I think a lot of the Buddha's metaphors that emerge from the early Pali Canon, which are really philosophies, things like the aggregate of the self and dependent co-arising, and all of these things are very substantive, and they're very good metaphors. But I am a very secular Buddhist. In the sense that I only regard this stuff as material for further thinking. And the Buddha says, come and see, right? He doesn't say believe. Yes. He says, do these things, think about these things, and see for yourself. And so I took that invitation, and I found it very useful in combination with other things like the philosophy of Charles Sanders Peirce, the 19th century American philosopher, systems theory, Gregory Bateson's work, other areas of interest, biosemiotics, especially, and semiotics in general. So it's just one of my sort of frames that I found useful in searching. But I also think that it's really important that we recognize all of this as kind of bricolage, right? You take what's useful to you, and then you move on. Mm-hmm. If you get stuck, you end up like in habit and ritual, when what you really wanted to do was to continue an exploration. And Charles Sanders Peirce has a great quote. He says, on every wall of the city of philosophy should be written, do not block the way of inquiry. Mm-hmm. And this should be really the only mantra, in my opinion, of a thinking person. Do not block the way of inquiry. Do not absorb things that stop you from pushing forward and take them as truths, and stop looking for other models for the world. Otherwise, I think you start to get old in your thinking, right? You start to get bored, and you tend toward error as well. Like as soon as it becomes doctrinal, it becomes useless.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm just going to relate this back to science fiction and fantasy. And I think especially science fiction in particular, is the literature of questioning. I feel like it's the fiction of questioning. Maybe I shouldn't say literature.
I am not always a huge fan of science fiction in the way I guess I'm supposed to be, because I read extremely widely, and I'm not as well read as many others are in the genre. Although I also think the genre is so big now that none of us are as well read as we used to be in it. I have my own, foibles as a reader of science fiction. And then one thing that I would say, and I think this is true. I certainly feel this. A writer is not a reader. These are two different kinds of creatures, and there's overlap between them, but they're not the same thing. I think that one of the most amazing things to find as a writer is a reader, like a pure reader, who is engaged in the act of reading for reading's sake. I don't believe that most writers are engaged in the act of reading for reading's sake. You're engaged in the act of reading for writing's sake.
Right.
And so we read in a completely different way. And in some ways, I feel like being a writer ruins reading. And in some ways, I feel like being a writer really enriches reading. But what it certainly does is turn it into a very different thing than what reading is for a reader who is not trying to write.
Right.
And so, as a writer who reads and not a reader in the purest sense, I feel a responsibility to spend most of my time outside the boundaries of science fiction. But as a writer, I completely agree with you. I think that science fiction is this amazing tool for exploring all of these questions. And one of the great things that science fiction is capable of doing is just moving a piece on the chessboard and then seeing how that affects the game, right? Yeah. And that's something that you can rarely do well, or as drastically at least, in what they call mainstream fiction, which I would just call, modern secular fiction, mundane fiction, what you will. It's a sort of genre of its own. What it can't do is really twist something about the world and then watch how that twist plays out in everything else, right? For me, it's science fiction is about building these alternate histories of past, present, and future, right? It's every story is an alternate history of one of those or several of those. But whether it's an alternate history of the past, present, or future, it's always engaged with the present, right? It's always a commentary of some kind on our present moment. Otherwise, it wouldn't have any meaning to us at all. So one of the other great things about science fiction is it's always participating in this dual way of looking at the world. Like, here's how it could be in the future or the past, right? But here's also what might be wrong with the way it is now, right? Or here's how things could be different now.
It all seems dead on to me. I mean, and I think science fiction, well, I mean, there's the people always talk about literalizing the metaphor, but I think science fiction offers a depth of, I don't know, of symbolism and tropes. And I don't know, there's just a lot of wonderful toys in that play box there.
There are a lot of really wonderful tropes and toys and things in that particular sort of sandbox. It's also, science fiction is canon, right? Like so many books that are canon are science fiction or speculative fiction books. And I think it's only that there's been this defensive reflex. Well, there's been two things happen. First of all, I think within science fiction, there was a defensive reflex to define science fiction and exclude a lot of things from it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was quite ugly in many ways, right? And it was this very reductive definition of what science fiction should be and quote unquote is, right? And the funny thing about it is some of the people that we think of as golden age never participated in that kind of science fiction. Like Ray Bradbury couldn't have given two shits about science.
Right.
Like, but he was a master of science fiction, right? Kurt Vonnegut, same. He never really wrote about science at all. Philip K. Dick. I mean, there are these, amazing, huge, towering giants of the genre that would not have fit into any of the strictest definitions of the genre whatsoever. But then from the mainstream, there was this other reaction. And I think that in order to bolster its own sense of seriousness, mainstream fiction needed the foil of science fiction and fantasy and horror and these quote unquote genres. None of those genres are anything but the mainstream of human storytelling, which is a speculative form of human storytelling. But in order to set itself apart, I think this like secular fiction that came to dominate the bookshelves in the 20th century really needed to push away science fiction and other genres.
Interesting. Yeah.
You probably have more thought on that than I do. You read a lot more than I do. I mean, just because you're a much faster reader than me, and I am admittedly a very slow reader.
Well, I mean, I would say that about half of my reading is in science fiction and the other half is doing history or literature or gardening books or whatever. I'm doing right now a big read through my anthology shelf where I'm going through each anthology volume by volume and looking at what's in it. And it's been very interesting and instructive. But I just finished Michael Bishop's Light Years in Dark, which is a heavily literary anthology and starts with a J.G. Ballard in very complicated, maybe overly complicated story. But I mean, science fiction has so many wonderful prose stylists in it, and as you say, science fiction, the sciencey part is as much prop, I think, as anything else. Although some people make the science front and center.
Yeah, I mean, I actually I would say The Mountain and the Sea is an example of trying to put the science very front and center.
Absolutely.
I can do the quote unquote, hard science fiction, and I like that because I think science is a wonderful tool for modeling the world and understanding things. But science can also just be a prop in stories that I write as well. It just depends on how I feel like using it in the moment and how it fits into the idea. The most important thing for me is the idea and getting that idea across, right? And so it's fun to play with genre tropes. I mean, The Mountain and the Sea is filled with references to Frankenstein, right? References to The Tempest, right? References to all of these like different genres and
Jack London.
And I think that's part of the fun of it. But there's also, there's the serious side of things, which is, science fiction and science in general give us sophisticated tools for looking at the world that aren't there in secular fiction's obsession with human relationships to the exclusion of all else. Right?
Yeah.
How did you construct the octopus language? Because I mean, that was really interesting how you did that, and you obviously tried to use some, linguistic ideas and some scientific ideas, and then had to portray that in writing. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I was looking for, first of all, something that would be, for me, scientifically convincing. And so I was looking for something that the octopus could exact. That means, to use some kind of bodily capacity, some kind of affordance that the body already has to do something it wasn't initially intended to do. Familiar for human beings, right, is speech. It's an exaction of our breathing and our eating mechanisms to do something that they weren't actually designed to do. And that is to make coherent noises at each other, which would then eventually become speech. And so I was looking for something that the octopus could do now, the real octopuses can do, that might be exacted to use as a method for communicating symbolic language. Symbolic language is really key because it allows people to construct entire ideologies, stories, governments, kinds of things that animals can't really do except on a simpler level. It's not that the animals aren't intelligent. It's that symbols and symbolic language really are this emergent kind of force that increases by about 1,000-fold or more a species' ability to pass on its knowledge from one to another. And so I was looking for something like that, and I decided on the passing cloud. This is a thing that many species of octopus do, and cuttlefish as well. When they're hunting, they will pass a shadow across their skin. They basically create this fake shadow that they move from one side of their body to another. And this demonstrates that they have an ability to very quickly manipulate which areas of their skin are light or dark. And I thought you could use this as a sort of writing system. And the octopus could sign, right, or write symbols on its skin if it learned to do that. So that was a way of exaction. And then when dealing with the symbols themselves, I just used a lot of study of language and how we've determined or we've theorized that the human beings came up with some of our written symbols. So, for example, some of the Chinese characters like house or person are very close in appearance to those iconic representations of those things in the world. And then later things become more abstract. So I thought that the octopus would probably draw from objects in its environment to then make more abstract meanings. And so that was kind of the basis for developing the language.
That was really one of the highlights, I thought, was just the ways that you got to talk about language and symbolic language kind of via the octopus and Evrim.
Yeah.
We have not touched upon one of my favorite characters at all, so we may not have time for that. Might have to ask Ray back again.
I would not be against it.
Well, we still have a few minutes. We can probably squeeze it in, at least a little bit.
Well, talk to me a little bit about Evrim and where that character came from.
Yeah, so Evrim for me, so this is one of the magical sort of moments of writing. I was writing, I think it was chapter 4 or 5 in the book. I forget which one it is that has Evrim on the beach. I think it might be chapter 5, but I could be wrong. I didn't know who the third member of that team was going to be. I had invented created Ha and Altan Setseg, those two characters. But I didn't know who the third member was going to be. And Evrim sort of appeared on the beach and became the thing that was actually the moment in which I knew I had a novel on my hands, right? That I finally, it all clicked and this became a book when Evrim just appeared on their own and became a part of the story, because Evrim allowed me to have this funhouse sort of mirror arrangement where everyone then in the book becomes a way of demonstrating points of view on consciousness and communications in a way that it wouldn't have been if it was just Ha trying to communicate with the octopus.
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of one of those magical, moments in writing where you're pulling from, I don't know what people want to call it, subconscious, your unconscious. You're pulling from something that's just below the surface, maybe of your conscious mind. You're not quite aware of where it comes from, but it comes from you. It comes from your experience. And I had a character named Evrim, a very different kind of android, in a story called Evrim's Children. And so Evrim wasn't entirely new. Evrim was sort of based on my ideas about how an android might be constructed. I have some fundamental nitpicks with how AI is done or talked about, because I don't think that the current fashionable thing that they're calling AI, which is just machine learning, is anything particularly impressive. And it's certainly not going to result, in my opinion, in a conscious mind. But Evrim is very different. Evrim is, of course, a neural map of the connectome of real people, then combined into this being. And so Evrim is not the kind of AI that we're used to seeing right now, if you could even really call it artificial intelligence.
Right.
It's a misnomer. So it was also a way to kind of introduce a different way of thinking about artificial intelligence. I think that one of the fundamental misconceptions of science is that the computer, right, is a model of how computational activity takes place. And we have flipped that model and now decided without evidence that the human brain is like a computer.
Right.
The human brain is not like a computer at all. And any good neurologist, right, and any good scientist will tell you, A, we don't understand very much about the human brain, period. But B, it is not a computer. And that is not what it's doing.
Right.
And so, I think that we're kind of at this somewhat scary point in history. We're about to do a lot of really dumb things with machine learning. And at the same time, we fundamentally as a society don't understand what this thing is.
Yeah.
And that's kind of, sorry, that's somewhat of a sidetrack from talking about Evrim. But Evrim is also kind of my frustration at what I consider to be, our current state of artificial intelligence, which is, trying to bring the factory into creativity,
right,
rather than trying to understand better what consciousness and minds really are,
right,
and maybe become fascinated by those things and try to do this in a rich and responsible way.
Yeah, very interesting. I also agree with everything you said there. I don't know, Ray. You know,
we should hang out, Alan.
I think we should. I think we should, Ray. Are you coming to Stoker Con by any chance?
I don't think I am, but I will be, I think, at Capclave.
Oh, okay.
Because it's really like right around the corner from my house. The thing is that I was overseas for 20 years and I traveled constantly. And so now every time I'm invited to travel anywhere, I'm like, really?
No.
I just want to stay at home. Like, I feel like I did a lifetime of traveling.
Yeah.
I'm kind of done, and I love my little apartment and my bird feeder. And, I just want to hang out at home with my family.
Makes
That's
sense.
so funny. Kids change that in you too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That is so true. They really, really do.
Well, we do have to start wrapping up, as Kat alluded to earlier. We have a few questions that we ask everybody.
Okay.
So the first one is, what is giving you hope right now?
What is giving me hope right now? Well, I think we talked a little bit about it earlier. I think that one of the things that gives me hope is that human beings are starting to understand the limitations of what this world can bear. And I think it is starting to change the way we think about ethics, and starting to change the way we think about our actions. And I do believe that eventually some of those, changes might lead to some better way of structuring our world, healthier way. I do. I think that human beings are not well designed to deal in abstract. So I do think things are going to get worse before they get better, because you sort of need to see the beast, right? Before they can, as a group, really make a change in behavior. But I think that we will. And so that I think that, we're on the right track. I think that science is on the right track, and dealing with systems and being more cognizant of its gaps and what it does and doesn't understand. And so those things give me hope. I think we're entering into a sort of a more sensitive era that's more led by ecology and less led by exploitation. That's not true of all of us, of course, but
Yeah. And so what are your upcoming projects? You kind of talked about them briefly before, but why don't you just lay them all out for us so we can have them all in one place?
So I never really talk about what I'm working on as a rule, and there's a good reason for that, and that's
totally fine and totally understandable.
When I talk about it, it seems to draw some kind of power out of it. Like it's the telling of the story that is the thing that gives it energy. And if I tell even a little bit of the story, I feel like it drains it a little bit. But I did just finish the second draft of another novel.
Nice.
I'm sorry, I lied. I finished the first, so halfway through the second draft. Some part of my brain really wants me to be done with that and told me to this then. That's not true. I still have work to do. But I'll soon be handing that off to my agent. It's very, very different. You should just know, that I don't intend to ever write the same book twice.
That's awesome.
Like it. I really intend to write whatever it is that I am most interested in the moment. And the idea that I just got out at the Salton Sea, we're driving out there, is going to be, so this book that I just finished is quite different, very different. But the next book is going to be so much more different. And that is that I think the initial reaction of a lot of people will be like, how could this possibly be the same person as the person who wrote The Mountain and the Sea?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm loving playing around with it right now, because I'm in that Cat, you'll appreciate this. I'm in that like initial just messing around with the idea.
Oh, that's the best, because you can do anything.
So fun. I love it. I just love that part where you don't even quite know what you're researching yet.
No, but you don't have to do that thing where you examine the item and go, oh shit, is this another plot thread I'm going to have to reconcile?
Yeah, so I'm like a kitten with a ball of string right now, and I'm having a fantastic time.
That is the best phase. I agree.
That's so funny. I love it. Okay, and then last thing, where can we find you on the interwebs?
So I have a website at raynayler.net, and that actually has a ton of my short work on there if people are interested in reading that. And then I'm Ray Nayler is my handle on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. So I'm really easy to find. But, like I'll point this out like I have before. My birth name is Renald Patrice de Mul Nayler. And I shortened it,
nice,
Americans, to Ray Nayler, because I got tired of people mispronouncing my name. And y'all still spell it wrong. so it is Nayler with an E.
Nayler with an E. If you take nothing away from this interview except one thing, it's Nayler with an
Yes.
E.
With an
There you
E.
go.
So I'm quite easy to find as long as you can spell my name right. And and even if you can't, I seem to pop up anyway nowadays. So yeah, that's it. I mean, Twitter, I'm trying to hang in there. It's kind of nice.
It's
Right?
hard. It's weird.
It just feels like a bit of a ghost town, and then like there's just this awful feeling of like it's like as if Edison or Alexander Graham Bell rather just screamed an obscenity at you every time you picked up the telephone, right?
Yeah.
And you're like, why is this happening? Like, why is this allowed to happen? This is a utility. Go away.
So true.
Or you like smeared your phone with like, I don't know, peanut butter or something as a prank,
Yeah.
Kat, Alan, has been really lovely to speak with you both, honestly.
No, thank you so much.
Definitely have you back.
Thank you. And Kat, and both of you, I'm looking forward to meeting in person sometime.
Definitely.
Awesome.
And that was our interview with Ray Nayler. Before we continue on, don't forget to share our podcast with your friends on Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media site that you're on. If you really like what we're doing, you can check us out on Patreon /If This Goes On. If you're not able to contribute on a regular basis, you can find us on Ko-fi, that's Kofi. Or, just help out however you can. Just retweet us or something. That would be great. Any little bit helps. So anyway, Kat, thoughts, opinions?
I thought that was just a terrific interview. I have been looking forward to it since we first talked to Ray about coming on, and he certainly delivered an interesting and wide-ranging interview, I thought.
Wow, yes, we are all over the place, and I am happy to say that we have hit like all of the areas that I really wanted to hit. Of course, there were some small topics that we didn't get to. I really wanted to talk about the little sections between chapters. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Those were so good. So good. Anyway, anything you're reading right now that you want to talk about?
I'm just finished KB Wager's A Pale Light in the Black, which is a lot of fun. It's a really well done read with a great cast of characters.
And I am reading Girl Out of Time, which is for an upcoming interview. So I'm only halfway through it, but it seems pretty fun. It's a middle grade book, which is not something I normally read for myself. So that's pretty interesting. But it's really fun. It's kind of science fiction-y, all over the place, kind of like superheroes, but also kind of just hitting like all the, I don't know, what are you going to say? Like all the science fiction fantasies that are out there. Like you want to know what it's like to be able to fly, you want to know what it's like to be invisible, all that kind of stuff. So it's really cool. It's really fun so far. And I'll be talking about it more in our next interview. And so I think that's that.
That's it. Been a lovely time.
It has been. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We appreciate it. We are keeping hope alive, one episode at a time. If This Goes On, Don't Panic is edited by Alan Bailey and produced by Ken Schrader. Our theme music is by Father Flamethrower. Additional music is by Christopher Snydrowski and outro music by Sable Aradia. Intro by Dave Robison. A special thanks to our guest, Ray Nayler. Thanks for supporting us, and we'll see you again soon.